It is an enormous pleasure for me to be here. The last time I was in St. Petersburg, it was, what did we say? 99, and it was one of the coldest days ever. It was in this building. We all had our coats on, our hats, our scarves, and we had a very serious 2-day seminar. 20 people freezing to death, almost. I think if we would have stayed 5 days, we would have frozen. But it was memorable. That's one meeting I will never forget. And it is just wonderful to reconnect with Olga, whom I knew in New York and then in Chicago, etc. So I understand that you're starting this program on cities. So I am just going to talk. Can you hear me if I speak this way? Can you hear me well? Or is this better? Is it better? Okay. So I'm going to just throw myself, without any sort of introductions, into the subject of the city, particularly global cities, of which there are about 100 today. And so what I want to do is to sort of take you a bit on a trip that specifies some of the conceptual questions and also moves through quite a bit of a certain sort of empirics. It is really geared towards understanding how do we do research about cities in an interconnected world, which is quite a challenge. Now, so I have a few slides, and by the way, I have actually a lot of slides, but I will not go through all of them. I will leave the how do we call it, the file here. So those of you who really want to see it all, you can, there must be some sort of, how do we call it, website. So the first point that I want to make is that I like to, it's a bit of a provocation, but not only a provocation. And that is that there is no such thing as the global economy. Doesn't exist, the global economy. What does exist, but it's not everything, is a multiplication in a vast number of circuits that connect very particular sectors within very particular places, with cities being major places in this story, but not the only ones. And so that means, for instance, that if I'm interested in understanding St. Petersburg, if I were here, that I would want to understand what are all the circuits on which St. Petersburg is connected. That's empirical work. You start with the firms, museums, cultural institutions, political institutions, and then I would compare it with Moscow, for instance. And there you would see that they are not all the same. This brings me to a second proposition that is very important in the work that I am doing and that I think that needs to be done. And that is to move away from this flattening notion that cities compete with each other. The only ones who win from that notion that all cities are competing with each other are those who launch that competition, often big corporate firms. So I have from the beginning, this is work that I've been doing for a very long time. My site was New York City. I saw how the government of New York City gave it all away to big corporations, free land, no taxes, nothing asked. Because what was the discourse at that point? It was the discourse of hypermobility. We can go wherever we want. In my research, I was finding that most of these firms need multiple cities. If you look at the top 100 specialized service firms, in other words, not material stuff, immaterial, digitized very often, lawyering, accounting, tech, etc. They have offices in 600 cities. Every big global firm needs multiple cities. Out of that also for me comes a certain kind of possibility of a politics, but we might get to that at the end. But the point here is that the language, the politics of that earlier period, and it still continues today, was sort of a fear of losing out. as opposed to understanding we cities are strategic production sites, production places for a whole variety of key inputs. The more complex the global economy becomes, the more the kind of knowledge that needs to be produced, that they need, that they must have, cannot be reduced to specialized firms, cannot be reduced to sort of whatever academic findings. No, it is a strange making of a kind of urban knowledge capital, and the emphasis is on knowledge, where that urban knowledge capital is more than the sum of all the brilliant experts, and it's more than the sum of all the firms that are specialized in this or in that. The city itself becomes a kind of a space that enables this multiplication, this scale up, and this making of something that winds up being very different from simply knowledge. You know, the knowledge that an academic might produce, or the knowledge that sort of a person might produce. So in that sense then, what I'm trying to show here are some of these circuits. Now again, this is empirical work. So I repeat, if I were in St. Petersburg, that would be a first stop for me. If I wanted to understand how it's not enough to know the size of the city, you need to know what are the other places with which it is connecting. And while I may emphasize the economy, there is culture, there is politics, there are NGOs, etc., etc. And so here, this was just because I am here, I decided to choose some of the BRICS global cities, and here are some of them. So you see that Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is a slide I made years ago. I didn't make it just to be here now because I'm here. So when you look at that kind of variability that I described, when the fact is not that one solid sort of clump that we call a city is competing with another one, then you also can begin to recognize that this adds a kind of flexibility. These are open systems. I like to think of the city as a complex but incomplete system. And in that mixture of complexity and incompleteness lies the capacity of the city to have long lives, much longer lives than very powerful firms and very powerful kingdoms and very powerful republics. Think of this city. It has outlived many, many different forms of power, right? From firms to regimes, etc. And in that sense then also, just to have density is not enough to have a city, right? So you can have an office park, extreme density. It's not a city. It's just built up, dense terrain. The same thing if you only have housing, like outside Shanghai, there are like 3 million people living in towers. That's not a city. A city is truly complex but incomplete, and that mixture really matters. The city is also the space where those without power can make claims, can make a politics, can make a culture, and in that sense, cityness matters. When you begin to have gated communities, etc., that is not so good. I want to ask you, am I speaking too fast, or are you following? Yes? Oh, it's okay? Very good. Okay, very glad. So in the meantime, you have read some of what I have there. Oh God, I just have to get I'm sorry here. So the other aspect is, and I have done a lot of work on this, is that part of these circuits is also the question of culture and politics. I love this example of NGOs about the environment, or against, what do I have here, fighting for rainforests, which the rainforests are only in certain parts of the world, Brazil, Indonesia, Central America, the main rainforests. The action of these, the activists are in multiple other places, including where the corporate headquarters are, like Tokyo, London, etc., where you don't have the rainforest. So this notion of this enormous, I don't know what to call it, but multi-sited operations that are a very important form of globalization. And I'm sure you are familiar, you know, with all kinds of possibilities and variations in this. And so the one side of this is then that you have a kind of an urbanizing of global networks. It's interesting for me, I do a lot of work on environmental activism, that the environmental activists very often are focused on places that are not cities, but they need the city as a critical place for part of their actions, not for all their actions. And in that sense, then, an urbanizing of global networks. Now, I wanted to give you a very simple visual example of this notion of the variability of cities, that cities are not as similar as some features of them make you think. And here the issue is, for instance, it's very common for people now to say that all cities are beginning to look the same. They look the same. Are they the same? That's the question. So, for instance, yes, we have a standardizing of consumption markets. You have the same types of firms everywhere. But, and this is sort of an argument that I have developed at length somewhere, the infrastructural, which I define as that which is necessary but indeterminate, has moved up. So a lot of the state-of-the-art buildings are today infrastructure. So they may be the same, meet the same standards in many cities across the world, which has led people to say they are the same. But if they're infrastructure, the question is, how are they getting used? And once you put that question in, then you can detect enormous variability. An example that I always like to cite is the example of financial centers. So, take China. The 4 major financial centers in China, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, they are basically the same when it comes to that infrastructural, the built environment. They are totally different as financial centers. In the United States, Chicago and New York, if you look at the buildings, you know, at the built environment, you might say, well, they're doing the same stuff. They are not. They are very different. In the European space, London is different from Paris, is different from Frankfurt, etc., etc. Do you have a stock market here do you have a financial center in St. Petersburg, I assume, or not? Yes. Well, I'm sure that it is very different from Moscow, right? So, but I don't know, you have so many palaces that the visual order here might also make it different. So so here I look at density, the question of density. Now, these are maps that we prepared this project. Some of you may have heard of it, and if you haven't, I recommend going to the website. We produce a lot of stuff. The Urban Age project, which is based at the London School of Economics. And so these are actually based on statistics. This is not geo-imaging. Huh? This is just a visual rendering of statistics. So this is, I'm just going to run very quickly through this. This is density in Mumbai. Again, you don't see this anywhere when you are in Mumbai. This is not geo-imaging, all right? And this is Shanghai, which looks almost like just a building in Dubai, so to speak. Now, this is New York, which looks really quaint compared to Mumbai and Shanghai. And this is London, which is right now considered the leading sort of global corporate financial city in the world, which is this enormously distributed space with multiple centers. And it just struck me that St. Petersburg, in a way, has a bit of that, isn't it? It has a lot, because you have so much old, beautiful buildings. You don't have the center, but here is the most powerful center, again, corporate financial center in the world, and it is pretty low rise. But if you look at workplaces, and I'm sure that you could do the same for St. Petersburg, this is the density that you have. So, these are all relative measures. Now, looking at it from the side of the city, then you can see that the city can be located on multiple circuits. And again, this is sort of interesting research to do, and you've got to do the research. It's not enough to just ask people. You've got to actually, find the vectors, cultural, economic, financial, whatever they are, and see where is Petersburg, sort of St. Petersburg, connected. Now let's see what I have here. So yes, I think that this emergent intercity geography, so again, when I look at the global world, I don't see the global economy floating above it all. I see these very specific shapes. There is a lot of sort of, what I call here, these sort of geographies. But when I use the term geography, I mean that it has a shape. It's not everywhere, It's not just terrain. It's not space. And when you begin to overlap, I did this for the 4 Chinese financial centers, and it's quite extraordinary how different those geographies are for each major city. Of course, there's a bit of overlap always. Are you still understanding me or not? Yes? Okay, very good. And when you see from the perspective of circuits, like say the circuit for a very specific type of financial market. Right now we have, in the financial world, we have over 100 specialized financial markets. So they are different, you see. And then you begin to really understand what we're talking about when we talk about global finance. It is highly structured. Each of these financial circuits has a different geography almost. And for instance, I don't know if I have a slide on this or not. So if you take gold actually operates in multiple circuits, right? So if you look at gold, the commodity, which is a low-level financializing of a good, Sydney, Johannesburg, and Brazil, Sao Paulo, are the key places because they also have the actual mineral. If you look at the financial instrument, London, Zurich are the key. And if you look at the actual metal, the metal is not a commodity. You have Mumbai and Dubai. So you can take one good or bad, whatever, and you get all these different specific geographies. And then you really begin to look at this thing that we call the global economy, the global world, etc., in very different ways. Now, I look a lot at migration, I look a lot at environmental activists, as I said, then you get totally different types of maps. But cities are always also in there. Now, a key element in my analysis is that these global cities, they're not about headquarters. Again, I like to throw these very strong statements out. Of course, they have headquarters. And some headquarters, financial headquarters, yes, but that's a certain kind of, because ultimately finance is meant to be a service industry, right? What I was just going to say something about. Yeah, right. So the global city is, in my analysis, a site of production. It makes an intangible good or series of goods, but it's not simply about headquarters. In many countries where there is a choice, the headquarters in the United States is one example. The headquarters leave the big cities, but they can only leave the big cities if they have access to that site of production. That site of production consists, I already alluded to it earlier, of a whole set of very, very specialized knowledge sectors. And that includes also financial instruments. And I will return to finance, which I'm a critic of high finance. I think it is the most devastating force we have right now. It's very different from traditional banking. So the key about the global city is this knowledge production. So one thing that has interested me is diverse types of knowledge. So when I was in Chicago for 10 years, and Chicago is the second most powerful financial center in the United States, but its history is totally different. And I used the case of Chicago to begin to understand, where does this knowledge function come from? And again, I threw out a very strong proposition, and I said that the deep economic history of place actually matters. The tendency is to think all these innovations, so knowledge begins where the latest innovation, comes down to the earth, so to say. And I found that very problematic. And a good example here is Hong Kong. When Hong Kong returns in 1997 to the People's Republic of China, you remember that, right? People thought Hong Kong is finished. And I said no, because what has made, I remember I wrote an article in 1997 saying no, because what has made Hong Kong is a deep sort of history of knowledge making, and that's very different from Shanghai. Shanghai being what the Central Committee wanted to enable to become the new Hong Kong, so to say. But the history of Hong Kong is so specific, so full with productive elements, that no way that Hong Kong was finished. And in fact, Hong Kong today remains the leading international center in China, and Shanghai is the biggest national. National does not preclude that you have foreign money there, but it is a national financial center, basically. Now, in the case of Chicago, what intrigued me, and I think Chicago is a very good story to understand a kind of knowledge making which is really connected with material practices. So as some of you may know, you know the instrument called derivative, right? Which is the most powerful sort of financial instrument. Derives its value from something else. So it can produce enormously speculative sort of trends, if you want. Now, in Chicago, you have a kind of industrial history, industrial scale agriculture, industrial scale sort of making of manufactured goods. Huge. Chicago is one of these cities of enormous, everything is huge, and that early history was marked by that. Now, you all know about the Adam Smith market, right? The Adam Smith market is the market of producers. It's not the buyers, it's producers. So the producers, imagine the village. My tomatoes are smaller than his tomatoes. I will lower my price because otherwise I can't compete. By the way, we have moved far away from that kind of market. But so in Chicago, you have that moment, they're selling pigs and corn. I'm just going to very material goods to get a very complex, that's the invention, that's the beginning of the derivative, which is now the dominant instrument. So when you just have a few pigs, you get to know your pigs, you really know them. And this is a good pig, this is a good tomato. When you are generating 1 million pigs, you don't know your pigs. So you have to set a price, a future price. And that is, of course, a speculative moment. But you have some sense. In New York City, where they don't grow pigs, maybe they grow 1 pig, but they don't grow, it would be almost inconceivable. So that in Chicago, with corn, with pigs, with also some other more complex sort of made manufactured goods, they sort of need to develop an instrument that produces, that estimates a future value. That is the beginning of highly speculative finance. That's not based on contracts, that's not based. And so what I love about this story is the fact that this very complex instrument that is then made illegal because it's so speculative, and that is not sort of brought back to 1973, actually begins with very, very material goods and material practices. It is one way of capturing what I mean when I say that the deep economic history of a place matters. I use this example because it's sort of almost the opposite of what you might expect, because it deals with pigs and, you know, rather than fancy creative classes. But you see a lot of that. So, for instance, if I were in St. Petersburg, I would want to know something about that deep economic history of this city. And let's see. So here, what I have here is that Sao Paulo, Chicago, and Shanghai, all three, share that kind of knowledge, a knowledge that is based on very material production. So in that sense, you could say that Hong Kong and New York are much more similar and connected, and that Chicago, Sao Paulo, and Shanghai are also connected. So this is a second order of sort of, you know, of articulation and level of, if you want, reality within which these cities function in these global configurations. So I already answered this question, you know, where does a city's knowledge economy come from? It often comes from that deep economic history. So I would think that Moscow and St. Petersburg are very different. They have very different knowledge histories, and hence they probably specialize, including in the financial sector, which seems so abstract and removed. They specialize in very different types of things. Now then the question still comes back to us, and what is it that globalization homogenizes? Because we have that story. Now I already alluded to one element, which is that the state-of-the-art built environment is becomes a kind of infrastructure. In other words, you need that state-of-the-art, but it is indeterminate. So it's the same in Chicago as in New York, it's the same in Hong Kong as in Shanghai, but basically the question becomes, what is it getting used for? Once you ask that question, once you put it that way, you can actually begin to contest this notion that all cities are becoming the same. If all cities are the same, they are in competition with each other. The only winners of that argument are the firms, in a way, who then can pretend, you know, if you don't take me under my terms, then I go there. And that's not true. I already mentioned earlier that most firms need multiple cities to put their offices in. And for me, I mean, coming from a capitalist country, the struggle to gain something, to take something away from these big firms is a critical struggle. I mean, Russia has a different history, but certainly in the West, that's a very big deal. So in that sense, this final point, the state-of-the-art built environment, and I mean the state-of-the-art built environment, all right, is a kind of new infrastructure or a new type of infrastructure. It doesn't look like infrastructure, but it is. An image that I use is that if you take the typical office buildings that were built in the 1960s in the West, you know, these glass towers, they sort of had a clear language. They said, we are about office jobs. And most of the workers in those buildings were secretaries, they were clerical workers, etc., etc. Today, so they spoke a clear language. Today, you don't know what you're looking at. There are certainly not going to be mostly secretaries in those jobs. The secretaries are clerical factories in Jamaica or in China or in the suburbs or whatever. They're not. So the question really becomes, okay, state-of-the-art built environment. How is it used? What is it used for? When you put it that way, you open up a whole research agenda about these specialized differences among cities. Now let's see. So here, well, this is already repetition. Now, it's also the fact of these specialized differences, not generic differences, but specialized differences, which then explains why there are more and more global cities. Because I must tell you, in the 1980s, when I just began to do this research, people said eventually, experts said eventually, we're going to have one super global city. Especially the globalized sectors are very sort of intensive users of digital technology. They often deal with non-material quantities, even when it's a commodity that represents metal. The instrument is a digital instrument. So there is a lot of the digitizing. And in fact, of course, given what I just explained, what you have is more and more specialized differences among these global cities. So again, I repeat the case of the 4 Chinese cities, I repeat the case of the 2 American cities, Chicago and New York. I'm sure that St. Petersburg and Moscow are very different on these very particular vectors. All cities share a lot of problems, a lot of sort of, if you want, regular infrastructures like for electricity, for disposal of brown waters, whatever. But these particularly high-level, high-order functions, that is where the differences emerge. Now, what is also interesting is that we have about, really, right by now it's more like 300,000 of genuine, if you want, multinational corporations. Mostly, almost all have kept their headquarters in their national countries. Now, today we have a whole debate in the United States about several big corporations like the Apples and the Microsoft, etc., who are now being under a burden of paying more taxes, that they say we're going to go abroad, we're going to leave, we're setting our headquarters. But that's really a very new thing, and I'm not sure it will happen. But basically the pattern is these big firms go to many different cities, but the main headquarters they keep at home, which I think is also interesting. Now, in there might be all kinds of things, including political stuff, who knows what all. And then finally, I just want to say there is no perfect global city. It doesn't exist. So we have about 100 today, and you can think of the global city as a sort of frontier space. I always say that in today's world, the frontier is not at the edges of empire. It's in the center of the empire, and it is these big cities where different worlds mix, and partly that also has to do with this very almost experimental but innovative work of creating new instruments, of inventing new instruments, etc., etc. And so the final point here, today's global phase does not function through one imperial global capital that has it all. And of course, when you take the British Empire, well, it was London. When you take the Spanish Empire, it was Madrid. When you take the Dutch Empire, it was Amsterdam, etc., etc. So today it really is different. And if you think of the global city as a production site that is also a frontier space, then you can see that all major sort of economic zones, and some countries have more than one economic zone or economic vector, they each sort of are an occasion to produce, a global city. Now, I repeat, I think of the global city as a frontier space. It's where two differences meet. When this current global era started, a lot of the local economic elites, local political elites, local media elites didn't want anything to do with it. They were also in the United States, they resisted. In that sense, the global city became a space to also do cultural work, to transform local economic elites, to transform the notions of local governance. For instance, Mexico was under, this was one of the early cases. Mexico, the government was under enormous pressure from the United States, from the IMF, from all kinds of other actors like that, to privatize a lot of its economy, which was in the hand of the government. The government, it was Salinas, I don't know if you remember that, he was the president at that point. The government did not want to privatize, because that was the wealth of the country. Well, eventually, they were persuaded. They got a massive influx, billions, into the coffers. Salinas, by the way, wound up in jail, because of course there wasn't a lot of corruption. But then there was nothing left. So this is a very radical transformation. And I remember I was a fellow at Davos, the World Economic Forum, and they invited me, and so I decided to do I used it as field work. I found it terribly boring. It is basically rich corporations that invite academics, presidents, central bankers, sort of as entertainers. I literally felt like I was as an entertainer there. But anyhow, but there it was clear to me that at that time, in the 90s, in the late 90s, this was not about making business deals. You know what I'm talking when I say Davos, right? You know, okay. This was cultural work. This was the work of re-educating, in quotation marks, business elites, government elites, and media elites from the world. I mean, it was absolutely fascinating. I think Davos, you know, has gone through different phases, but that is what it was at that point. Now, very quickly, there are enormous costs of being a global city. I already wrote about that in my Global City book way back in the 90s. I got much criticized. There was an enormous amount of inequality, an enormous amount of homeless people, an enormous amount of displaced people, etc., etc. And the second one is the rise of high finance. And these are sort of, I want to very briefly look at that. So this is a fantastic, oh, I have a pointer here, right? This is a fantastic graph. This is the United States. Now, the United States is a pretty extreme case compared to, say, Europe. And this starts, let me see, does this? Yeah, there we go. So this is 1917. This is a beautiful curve. I love it when a curve tells a tale. You know, it has a very sharp. So this is the 20s, you know, the 30s, 40, the adorable Keynesian period in the West, right? 1980s, it goes up. I was already here at this point saying, we're headed towards growing inequality. Nobody believed me. There were articles written, why Sassen is wrong, you know? And so now this curve, what it is showing is, as you see here, the income share of the top 10% of earners. 10%, that's quite a bit. So at this, here they had about 47%, then it goes down to 33, still a very robust share. And then it goes back up, and this really goes up till the census, the 2009 census, but it got broken up here. Now, this is a period which we call the Keynesian decades, right? Now, there are two issues that are interesting here. One is the structure of the economy enabled if you want here, what we're seeing is the expansion of a modest middle class and the expansion of a prosperous working class. But it took a certain kind of economic structure, and it took policy. If you read the literature of this period, the notion was, we found the algorithm, we are never going to give it up, because there really was a visible expansion of the middle class. In other words, what you see here is the loss of the top. You can infer the growth of those middle sectors. And we know from other data that it is that way. Now, actually, it took a few decades, and then we were back into growing inequality. And so there is a very interesting lesson to be learned here, right? But this is not the subject that I want to discuss now, but basically the structure of the economy does matter, and the policy world also matters, but you need both. And right now, the structure of the economy in many of our countries is not going to enable that. Now, here is another version of that map, and here what I want to point out, most of the gain, this is growth after tax income. By the way, this is not about wealth, this is just the earnings on jobs. So you can see that the highest are the top, they grow by 281%. Then you have the top 5%, they grow by 95%, like this, the second fifth. And then almost 50%, zero gain, zero, in 30 years. And so my question then, when I look at this data, is what did we see at that time? Here, in this period, 89, 91, I was doing my research, what are we seeing? In fact, the visual order of the city did not necessarily tell you that this incredible lack of gains was happening among these lower. Because when you have this gentrification, you know what I mean by that, right? So it looks like there were whole parts of New York that were truly run down, but suddenly it looks like everything is becoming beautiful and good, etc. So the notion was that the discussion in New York, or in the United States, was everything is getting better. And I was saying no, you know, that we didn't have, I didn't have this much data, this long term to show. And well, we know that in fact, you know, gentrification means a massive displacement. We had vast numbers of homeless which were rendered invisible by exporting them to the suburbs and stuff like that. You know, I don't need to detail that, but we're still living under that. And what interests me here theoretically, that this is not really what I'm talking about, but just as a footnote, is how very material conditions are not necessarily telling the actual story. So and I feel that we're at that now, when the more prosperous, modest middle classes have been losing ground. I'm sure you know some of the data at least. And behind the facades of those modest middle class homes, the facades look the same. But behind the facades, there's a whole new history in the making of impoverishment, of doubling up, etc., etc. So again, sort of the theorist in me is very interested in the extent to which the visible material does not necessarily, you know, tell you the full story. And in this case, it's sort of a self-evident, but very often it is not, and we assume that it will. Now, I want to, 5 minutes, okay. So I want to ask you now, sort of to think, not you don't have to give me an answer, but I like this question, what is the steam engine of our epoch? And I give you a few seconds to sort of in your own mind find an answer. When I get a chance to ask, the typical answer, and I think it is a very good answer, is information technology, right? It's everywhere, directly or indirectly. That's the trick. And I say no, it's not. It is high finance. And now I want to show you why I mean that. And high finance is, I should just say that high finance is not about money. Traditional banking is about money. The bank sells money it has. Finance sells something it does not have. And in that selling what it does not have lies its incredible creativity and also, of course, its need to invade other sectors. The creativity is precisely sourced, provoked by that need to invade other sectors. So the derivative is the ultimate instrument here. Now let me show you a graph here. This is just one little bit of finance. It's this. So what I want to show you is this growth curve. Think of anything that can go from under $1 trillion. I don't know how, that's a lot of zeros. You know, I don't know how you say that. What is the familiar version for you? In 6 years, go to 62 trillion. That's jumps of orders of magnitude. That is not simply an increase. Those are different orders of magnitude. Now, these 62 trillion in 2008 were more than the total global GDP of all the countries, including China, which was 54 trillion. And this 62 trillion was just 10% of global finance as measured by outstanding derivatives, which is the standard measure. So that money, and now global finance is over $250 billion, which is 0, 0, 0, 0. I mean, it's just, you know. So this is not money. If you look at the actual supply of money in the world, which is not so easy to establish because it keeps changing. Some governments print new money, devaluations, etc. But it is more like 200 trillion, according to the central banks of the world. So in that sense, you know, very simply I say finance is not about money, and if you think that it is about money, you misunderstand finance. So I argue it's a steam engine with very destructive properties, and I just want to show you a couple of things here. The framing, I'm not going to read all of this, is when modest neighborhoods become part of global finance. Global finance invades sector after sector, including very modest sectors. Student loans, used car loans, modest neighborhoods. Now we had 5 years of a brutal history that produced, this is a total, it's now considered illegal as financial instruments. You know that a lot of financial instruments that produce vast amounts of profit are now illegal. You know that there's a lot of this stuff happening in the United States and in Europe. Anyhow, we wound up with over 13 million households out of their homes in a short history of 5 to 6 years. But actually the history continues because they're getting thrown out. 2013 and 2014 are the worst years. Again, there is no time to explain, but this was devastating. And here again, materiality. And we have now tent cities, thousands and thousands of people living in tent cities, invisible. The neighborhoods where all the houses are empty, invisible. I mean, they're material, but who would go there? Same thing with the tent cities. Once you are reduced to living in a tent city, we have tent cities in the desert also. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Now, people think, oh, that's the US. Well, no, also in Europe. This is an invisible. When you talk with the average expert on Germany's economy, they do not know that every year, mind you, this is cumulative, you understand? Every year, like in Germany, 2007, 91,000, in 2008, 88,000 thrown out of their homes. Hungary is 1 million in the last few years out of their homes. In Latvia, 360,000. In Spain, 470. Now, this is this peculiar instrument. Wait till it hits India and China. Devastations, because it's not declared illegal in the rest of the world. Now, this is the creativity of high finance. It invents an instrument. It's the physics of mathematics. It's the math of physicists. It's not the math. This has nothing to do with microeconomics. In other words, a mathematics that allows you to track something that you cannot really know. It's extraordinary. And, well, anyhow, there's much more to tell. But I have, oh, I forgot to say, I brought 2 books. And in this book, I have all these data that I've been talking about. And these books are for, where are you? For the libraries. Eh? And this is one on cities in the world economy. Now, let's see, I just, and this is the other market. I'll end on this note. This is an invented market which has minimum prices. Those are the minimum prices. Different nationalities in different markets. Those are the main nationalities of buyers. So here is one slide. Monaco, London, New York, Dubai, Paris, Moscow, Singapore, Shanghai, Hong Kong. Those are the main cities. De facto, the price in London is 100 million, the minimum price. Same thing in New York. Invented market, none of those properties are worth that. And so I want to end on this final note, a little project that I'm doing, which is about who owns the city. Because a lot of this is foreign capital. You know, in principle, I'm not against foreign capital, but it is a kind of a way of owning whole parts of the city. And London is the most affected. All right, I think I have to end. Thank you very much for your attention.